As we transition into week 5 of fall 2020, the most important thing to see us doing here is leading up to the draft that'll be due at the beginning of next week. In terms of content on its way, I'll have sample analyses of both A and P and the Charge of the Light Brigade posted later this week. You can find those readings in the readings folder for our project, that is the short story critique. If you want to take a look at those first, go right ahead. Otherwise, like I said, I'll have the analyses up soon, so you can certainly just follow along through those analysis discussions. For now, start taking a look at the stories. And again, these stories are in the readings section of our project folder on Blackboard. Find something that grabs you. You've got the time to be able to look through those and really find something that you're actually interested in. I can't say this strongly enough. There is nothing to better doom a writing assignment than choosing something that bores you to have to write about. Try not to use something overly familiar. Actually, I've had a lot of people get into a lot of trouble by choosing a short story that they might have read over, say, in a high school English class. Oftentimes, the problem has been that they've had a really hard time breaking themselves away from whatever the analysis and interpretation were that they were taught back then. So, as I said, try to choose something new. That way, your reading of it is fresh, and you've got an equally fresh opportunity to make of it what you will now. After that, bear in mind, length is okay. It's actually sometimes better to have a longer short story to deal with. And I realize that seems like kind of an oxymoron. Oftentimes, the longer one of these is, the more material we've got to work with, the more of a chance we have to really get a hold of it, the more nuanced and more interesting it can be. There are a lot of reasons to put in the time to read that extra 10 pages rather than being afraid of anything of any length at all. The opposite is also true. Something that's very short might seem easier on the surface, but there's always the moment that you get to the end and go, great, what do I do with it now? So sometimes a short story isn't a great idea either. Finally, choose 2 to 3 candidates. In other words, identify 2 to 3 short stories that might be the ones that you use for the project. Again, so that you've got a chance to fall back if something doesn't work out the way you think it will. There have been a number of times in my own past when I've been working on a piece of analysis just to find that what I chose the first time for the analysis wasn't going to work out. If I was lucky, maybe I considered other topics, but to be honest, I didn't often do it. So this advice is coming from my own personal mistakes and wanting to make sure that none of you suffer for similar ones. Following that, review the guidelines. You've heard me say it many times before. You'll hear me say it many times after this. Really, this is one of the most important parts of any writing. Make sure you know exactly what the expectations for the writing are. Firstly, this is more than summary. It's analysis and argumentation. Remember that. The only summary that's going to be present here is that amount of summary necessary to bring the reader up to speed, to tell that reader what he or she needs to know so that he or she can understand your analysis. Now, it's an argument then about meaning, about what a short story means, about how we make certain decisions about what is meaningful. But the central subject of the argument is the meaning of the story and how we come about interpreting it. Relevance is a particularly important consideration here. Again, we can't just summarize for the sake of filling space or summarizing, right? Instead, there always has to be an evident reason for the summary that we focus on. Speaking of focus, we've got to focus on answering our question for analysis, and that's big. Being able to answer that question gives us kind of a lodestar, something to go back to whenever we feel like we might be getting off base. Lastly, another important note in the guidelines is reader awareness. We need to constantly be thinking about what points we need to fill the reader in on because he or she might be confused if we don't. It's an important part of the essay and a really necessary awareness to cultivate. As you go about choosing a question for analysis, ideally, it would be an interesting question that matches up with a short story you've already found interesting. Again, that's the ideal sort of hopeful case. It's the one that I hope we can bring about by really being careful about what we choose. The question you choose is the single most important source of relevance, focus, and assignment fulfillment guidance in this entire project. So, not only do we need to choose something that we will continue to find interesting, but we've got to keep going back to it. We cannot afford to begin writing about it and then just go higgledy piggledy onward. We got to keep coming back to it. Note that all of these questions for analysis come along with theoretical approaches stipulated. Now, I've done that as a way to be helpful. In the past, students have come to me and said, well, I've got this short story here. I like it. I just don't know what to do with it. So I'm trying to get past that part of the process. And by giving a little bit more direction in terms of what it is about the story that needs to be thought about, the question for analysis, and the way to think about it being the critical approach, that should help to get you over that first step and into the writing process. Now, consider that this is a good thing. You can always come back to that question. You can always look at it as the thing that you've got to be considering. Like I keep saying, it's going to give you that central point that you can hold on to. As you go to read up on the approaches, number one, think about what does it mean to be a critic of the site, a critic of the sort called for by the question of analysis that you chose. Think about it. Who have these critics been? What sorts of backgrounds have they had? Why have they decided that that particular way of making meaning made sense to them? Consider, how does the stipulated critical method dictate relevance of details? If I am a Marxist, details having to do with the trading of services for goods will be much more relevant than if I were, say, a new historicist critic, at which point I would be looking at the way that the short story tells me something about the moment in history where it takes place. Right? These things might be present in the same story, but my selection of one particular critical method will be what decides which one is more relevant. We need to know, what do critics who use these stipulated critical methods view as significant? What do those critics reject, if anything? Again, thinking about the new historicist critics, they largely reject the idea that simply by looking at history will allow us to explain a short story or poem or other piece of literature. That's where the new historicist approach comes from, that rejection. Finally, again, thinking about these things along those same lines, we need to ask, do the critical approaches you will be using come from any others? Are they updated or revised versions of other approaches? For example, there was originally feminism that comes out of the late 70s, where now that's in large part evolved into cultural, where now that has evolved into gender criticism, right? But we would need to remember that the one thing has come from the other. And like we've just talked about, there are certain ones of these critical approaches that come from the rejection of older versions of them. Finally, as we go about